This is Empowering Homeschool Conversations.
We want families to come here and gain insightful strategies that empower them to successfully teach diverse learners at home.
Hosted by founder and CEO of SPED Homeschool, Peggy Ployer.
Our goal is that these powerful weekly conversations will boost your confidence to cultivate the best at-home learning environment for your student.
For more homeschool resources, go to spedhomeschool.com. You're listening to Empowering Homeschool Conversations with Peggy Ployer.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Empowering Homeschool Conversations. Today, we are going to talk about homeschooling when grieving the loss of a child. This month, we are focusing on community stories from the depths of valleys to new heights is kind of what we're focusing these conversations on, and we're just hoping that the homeschool veterans that we have on our shows this month will just bring you encouragement and meet you maybe in some of the struggles that you're going through right now. And my guest is a returning guest, Nichelle Nelson. Welcome back, Nichelle.
Thank you. It's a joy to be here.
Yes, I thank you and I had thanked Nichelle when we had popped on earlier before the show, just for her willingness to talk about a really difficult time in her life and her family's life. And she has so much wisdom and encouragement and tips and advice to give to families who are going through grief. And we talked beforehand that, maybe you've never lost a child. Maybe you have another family member that you've lost, or you have a loss of some dreams for your child, which I know a lot of people in our community do. This conversation is for you. I just want you to pull up a comfy chair and join us for this time, because Nichelle has a lot of things that God has taught her through this journey, and I am certain that you will gain something that will empower you in your homeschool journey ahead, as well as your life and your walk with God. So Nichelle, I would just love to start out this conversation with you just giving a little bit of background about yourself and your family, and so our audience can get to know you a little bit more.
Alrighty, wonderful. Well, again, thank you for having me.
Yes.
My husband is retired Air Force, and we met when he got stationed to my hometown of Colorado Springs, and we began as young couples do, dream building. Creating in our minds, this future family that we were going to have. And so we immediately moved to the Azores, Portugal.
Wow.
And that spent our first 3 years of marriage there. And our firstborn daughter, Adrian, was born on the island of Terceira. And we did a lot of praying about what educational choices that we were going to have,
right,
about whether or not I was going to be a working mom or a stay-at-home mom, all of those choices. Well, it wasn't until we moved to Germany a few months. I think we moved to Germany when she was about 8 months old, when we met our first homeschool family. And so we were exposed to the homeschool community, and decided that was the path that we were going to go, not only for Adrian, but for future children that we were going to have. So long story short, we had 4 children in 4 countries.
That's an adventure in itself.
We spent 12 years living overseas, and in 1999, my husband retired from the Air Force, and we settled in just outside of Austin, Texas. Something that had happened when Adrian was 4, we had come back to the States. I think we were stationed in Germany at that time. We had come back to the States and had attended a Christian conference. And at that conference, Adrian witnessed worship dancing for the first time. And I mean, she was so determined to get out in the aisle and dance with them that she almost kicked me trying to get out. And I'm like, listen, listen, little girl, but I had no idea that burning calling that she had for
Wow.
dance. So, she was exposed to it in different forms. I used to dance as a teenager. So when she was probably about 8 or 9, I would choreograph little dances for her.
Oh,
Well, what a blessing, and how much a part of her calling was when we came to the Austin, Texas area. We were immediately put into position for her to develop relationship with 2 wonderful mentors in worship dance.
oh, that's amazing.
So by the time she was 12, she had danced with several worship dance teams. She had developed her own worship dance ministry. She was a soloist. She was invited to other churches. I mean, like, our calendar was
Wow.
full of all of these, dates for her to dance different places. So December of 2002, um, she, the only thing that I remember that may have changed physically was that she was beginning to pick up a little weight. But, I think she was 12, getting ready to be 13.
Right. All those hormones, you just
Yeah.
don't, it kind of, seems normal.
Right. So her dance teacher, mentioned something to me, like, we may want to start controlling our appetite, that sort of thing. Dance costumes only come in certain sizes, but other than that, nothing at all. So so her birthday, she was actually born on Christmas Day.
Aw.
So she was turning 13, December 25th of 2002. And 2 days before her birthday, we had planned a Christian bat mitzvah. It was like our own rite of passage ceremony. She had
Yeah.
already had a relationship with the Lord, but this was kind of her ability to dedicate her teen years to the Lord.
That is so cool. I love that.
And 3 other girlfriends, a set of twins, and another young lady, all ministers' children. They were all grew up in church. At this time, Adrian was 12. Our second born was 10. Our second born daughter was 10. Our son was 4, and our youngest was 2. So December 23rd, we were waiting. My mom was coming in. My mom and stepfather were coming in. This is going to be like a big family function. So I was out hanging Christmas lights, and she came out the garage door, and she said, "Mom, I have a headache." That was the first symptom, the very first symptom. 21 days later, she was gone
Wow.
from a brain tumor that we were only aware of for 72 hours. We had gone through 3 weeks of misdiagnoses, going back and forth to the pediatrician, but literally no other precipitating symptom. Over the course of
Wow.
that 3 weeks, her eyes began to cross. She was sleepy all the time. She couldn't keep anything down. Her gait was, which was very disconcerting. As a dancer, she was always very much in control of her body.
Right.
So for her to shuffle as she walked, I was talking in communication with her dance teacher, like, have you noticed anything? She said, absolutely not. So
What a shock. It's
3
just
weeks. Yeah.
so quick and with no sign of anything.
No,
But God
no.
had prepared her heart.
I believe so. So while she was hospitalized, we had only one cell phone then. And she kept asking for the phone. Now, we had been in the United States for maybe 3 years. So our community, our family, our extended family was still kind of back in Okinawa and in different parts of
Wow.
the country because
Yes.
we're a military family. So they were all over. So she was taking the phone and she was, before I tell you that,
Yeah.
when we got the diagnosis, uh, my husband and I were kind of holding the phone between us. Our pediatrician was not with us. She was talking to us over the phone. And she told us that Adrian had a brain tumor. Of course, I immediately fell apart. And
Right.
Adrian said to me, Mom, I am not going anywhere. But if I do go, I'm going to be with Jesus.
Oh,
And that was like all of the grief she would allow me in front of her at that time. And so she was calling people, talking to people on the phone. Everyone wanted to talk to her and everything, and she was just telling people to pray for her. Just pray for me, just pray for
wow.
me, just pray for me. So her faith was absolutely evident, absolutely uh uh
Mm.
on display.
Yes.
She was uh a light to so many people. um
Mm.
at the same time, because sometimes grief is compounded. I was very close to my mother's mother, my maternal grandmother. My mother was very young when she had me, and my maternal grandmother kind of filled that bond.
Huh. Uh-huh.
So Adrian went into ICU on one day, and in Kansas on the very following day, my grandmother went into ICU.
Oh,
And she
wow.
went into ICU. She ended up being intubated. She was grabbing family members' hands, asking them, trying to find out how Adrian was.
Wow.
So, in the midst of this, she's worried about Adrian. My mother is in Colorado, and she's trying to decide, do I go
Oh,
to
so
Texas to
hard.
be with my
Yes.
firstborn granddaughter, or do I go to Kansas to be with my mother? So, my uncle, who was a pastor, made the decision that everyone needs to go to Texas and support Nichelle and her family. And so, great aunts and uncles and all of my family, with the exception of him, who stayed in Kansas with my
Oh.
grandmother, they all came here.
Hmm.
And the morning of Adrian's funeral, we received the news that my grandmother had also passed.
Wow. That's a lot of
So,
loss in a very
a
short
lot,
amount of
a
time.
lot,
Oh, just
a
grief
lot.
for you. And, just thinking about how much that was to process in
Yes,
in such a short amount of time,
yes.
because you really didn't have time to really grieve ahead of time. So the
None.
grieving had to happen then
On the spot.
afterwards
Uh,
on the spot too. Yes.
I actually think that to a certain extent, I must have compartmentalized it because,
Hmm.
so my grandmother's funeral was 5 days after my daughter's. And um, I must have, and I used to always say, I would have talked to Adrian about losing Mama Dear, and
Hmm.
I would have talked to Mama Dear about losing Adrian.
Oh, wow.
And so I kind of put I had to live in the house that Adrian lived in.
Mm.
So I could kind of distance myself for a moment from
Right.
my grandmother. But I remember, and many times scientists will tell you that real grief begins to kick in about 3 months because your mind is still trying to come up with
Yeah, exactly.
alternate,
Yes. Mhm.
maybe they're gone on a trip, I'll see them soon, your mind is still trying to process that. And I remember 3 months later opening a drawer and seeing my grandmother's obituary and thinking, well, when did this happen, and why didn't
Wow.
anybody tell me? Because I was, and my second daughter and I always have this, so many people came in and out of our house for the first 3 months after
Oh.
Adrian passed that
Hmm.
I had no idea. I had no memory. And people had to tell me, yeah, I've been to your house. And so I started saying, was I here? Did I talk to them? Um, the mind does a number of tricks to try to hold this
Yeah.
grief and to try to process it. And so to have compounded grief
Right.
was
Yes.
definitely, I don't think that I could say that I was fully aware. Probably, I want to say, I really want to say like for the first 5 years, because I was
Wow.
going back and forth between
Mm.
uh, griefs, and we had other things, of course, that happened at that time, and life still happens,
Right.
which I think,
Exactly. Because you had younger kids that
yes,
were trying to go through the same process. And
exactly,
I know we talked a little bit ahead of time, just you had told me it's hard to help other people process when you don't even know how to do it yourself.
exactly, exactly.
And so how did you start that process just for yourself and going through what you needed to grieve?
So, one of the things that had happened to us when we were in Okinawa is that we had suffered a miscarriage. And our pastor had called me one day and he said, I know that this is a very difficult time, but you are stronger in your faith than many others. Would you be available to minister to other sisters in the church who have also lost a child? And so that
Wow.
began a relationship, a friendship that I still have to this day, with a woman named Denise. She miscarried very shortly after I did. And then we got pregnant again at the same time.
Oh,
And I delivered our healthy son in February of 1998. And in May of 1998, she delivered her son far too soon. And he lived about a month.
wow.
And so she became somehow, I don't know if it was the military, but she became acquainted with an organization, which is a nationwide organization. And your listeners can definitely find this organization on the internet, the Compassionate Friends.
Yes.
And
And
the
I will
compassion,
list that in the description too of the show so that you can just click on that link.
yes. So Denise introduced me to the Compassionate Friends, which is an organization that is specifically devoted to parents who have lost a child. We have a word in the English language for a person who has lost a spouse. We call them a widow or a widower.
Right. Yes.
We have a word for a child who has lost their parents, an orphan, but we have no word
Mm.
for a parent who has lost a child. The last thing that we ever expect to happen in life is to bury a child. We always expect that our children will bury us.
Yes.
I always knew that one terrible day I was going to have to live in this world without my grandmother.
Right.
But I
Yes.
never, ever expected that I was going to have to live in this world without my firstborn child, or any of my children for that matter.
Right.
Um, so we found a local organization of a local chapter of the Compassionate Friends. And my husband and I attended the first meeting, probably, I want to say, uh, within, I know it was in the first 6 to 8 weeks, because we had other children,
Right.
because we did not have the luxury
Mm.
to just stop, because everything in us wanted to just
Oh,
stop,
absolutely.
stop the world. Um, and we couldn't do that. And so we attended, I remember some of the first few meetings that we attended, some of the people it had been, you asked me before we started, like how many years it had been since Adrian.
Yeah.
It's been 20 years. We needed to speak to people who were 5 years out, 10 years out, 15
Right.
years out,
Mm-hmm.
because we needed to learn how it's this grief this hole is never going to go away. How do we live
Right.
with it? How do we
Yes.
continue
Yeah.
to move forward knowing that we have this hole?
Yeah.
And they were very helpful in learning different different ways to. Another thing that we had discussed earlier was my favorite definition of grief
Yes, I'd love for you to share that.
is love with nowhere to go.
Hmm.
We spend so much time pouring into uh, those that we love. I
Right.
can remember several months after Adrian's funeral, going to the cemetery and being so angry with God, just so angry,
Yeah.
and saying to him, as a mom, I did every single thing you asked me to do.
Right.
I bathed this body. I washed her hair. I taught her. I was her homeschool mom. I taught her to read. I taught her to pray. Everything. I did everything you asked me to do. And everything that I have done is now lying in this dirt.
Hmm.
And I felt his response was, you cared for her body, but the most important thing that you did was to teach her about me. So her body may be in this dirt, but she's with me.
Yes. Oh, that's
That
beautiful.
was so
Hmm.
comforting, so comforting. Those were the types of things that I needed to learn along the
Right.
way. I
Oh,
needed to
wow.
learn that I wasn't alone. I needed to learn that, one day I sat and I thought, there have been bereaved parents on this earth since Adam and Eve.
Yes.
Uh, because many times when we enter a difficult season, we feel we're the only ones who have ever been through this.
Absolutely. Yes. And it's
The
so
only
untrue. That
ones.
is such an attack of the enemy
Yes,
that you
it
are
absolutely
all
is.
alone. Yeah.
We talked about the concept of mirroring. And
Yes. I'd
one
love
of
for you
the
to talk about that.
so as humans, we uh, as babies, we learn to mirror facial expressions.
Hmm.
We learn to mirror emotions. We learn to mirror these things. The Bible tells us to rejoice with those who rejoice, and to mourn and to weep with those who weep. That's
Absolutely.
part of that mirroring. This is why we have public funerals,
Mm.
so that we can see that grief on one another's face. We have public weddings, so we can see that joy, and baby showers, so we can see that
Right.
joy on one another's face. We need that mirroring. And so grief support groups, um, sometimes people, I think they get a bad rap that maybe that means that I'm weak, or maybe
Oh,
that means that that there's some fault in me. No, you need that mirroring. You need to know
absolutely.
that uh, someone is bearing the same. It may not be the same grief, and that's another thing that we've learned. Even grief within one family, um, the loss of a mother-daughter relationship is not the same as the loss of a father-daughter relationship. It's not the
Right.
same as the loss of a sister.
Mm.
Um, those individual relationships are grieved separately because the relationships themselves are separately. And so being able to be in a support group and to hear something that might be similar, some uh, some experience that might be similar, something similar in the relationship, lets us know, I can, it's difficult, but I can do it. I can bear it. And so that's
Right. That
the
that hope that is there that other people can bring in,
Mhm.
just by sharing their stories, and even if they don't have answers, they're
Right.
there, and they can experience the depth
Mhm.
of what you've experienced, where most people who really want to be compassionate and come alongside you can't.
Right.
And that those types of groups that's why they're so successful, is
Yeah.
just because you can be yourself, you can release those emotions, be
Mhm.
real about how you feel. And I mean, God created us to feel, and it's not that it's wrong that we grieve. We have to go through that process, and really kind of just take that path like your family did and you did,
Yeah.
in order to really understand him and his just how he wanted to use that circumstance with your family and each individual. I've never thought about it, how differently different individuals, because of a relationship, would grieve. And so thank you for sharing that, because as you know, how was it different between your grief and your husband's grief, and then also the grief of your children?
One thing that is different, of course, is in the way that we express it. I was in a terrible college class where the woman who was basically saying, well, it's at the time it was 2020. It's 2020, and men just need to learn how to cry. And this 19-year-old in the back of the room held up his hand, and he said, my father and I, we expressed our grief in providing. And, we knew all these family members were going to come. And so we set up chairs and tables and things like that. And she totally dismissed that. It is important to give space
Yes.
to others for how their grief is expressed. Not everyone cries, or at least not everyone cries publicly. And learning how that there are different modalities of grieving. But you only learn to recognize them. Sometimes the mirroring is not good, because we think that someone in that mirroring should be doing the same thing that we are. And we definitely learned that we need to allow for because the relationships were individual. We need to allow for the individual expressions of grief. And that's another plus for grief support organizations, because they are full of ideas. So we were, let me say one thing before I talk about another organization. I talked a bit about compartmentalizing.
Yes.
Adrian died in the middle of the school year. And I still had, I think, kindergartner, first grader, and a sixth grader. How do you continue with this curriculum that says, ask your students? I've gone because I would teach them history on the same level. I would teach them science on the same level, math, and of course, math and I think language might have been individual.
Right.
But now I'm only asking one person. So I immediately had to change curriculum. I had to find a different kind of curriculum. So that went out. I also had to allow time. It was a bit before we could just get back into, not even to get back into the routine we had, but to create a new one.
Absolutely. It's the dynamics changes when you have different age kids, and that happened abruptly to you, not something that you could really plan.
Right.
And just giving yourself the time to figure out what is that going to look like. And while you're going through this process of not only grieving your daughter, but your grandmother and everything else that just had changed overnight for you.
Had to change our schoolroom, had to change the bedroom that our daughter, our second daughter, had never slept in, a room that her sister had not been in.
Wow.
So, and so, you asked about the difference in relationships. That kind of grief, that sister relationship was almost like a widower. Like she was born with a partner in crime. They were 20 months apart. And so to go from this double to single in every aspect. She talked about going into restaurants and always getting seated next to the empty chair, because tables, restaurant, table seat 6. And we had been a family of 6. And now we were a family of 5. Well, we're still a family of 6, but with a missing person. and so being conscious of going into a restaurant and making sure we actually ended up what it ended up doing is half of our family is, well, two of us are left-handed and the rest are
Okay.
right-handed. So we ended up, and to this day, the lefties sit on one side of the table and the righties on the other. That way, she never had to worry about sitting next to the empty chair.
Oh,
So, there's so many things. So I wanted to make sure that, so my father-in-law had planned to stay, but because my grandmother passed, he went home and he came back a few months later. And I remember him sitting down and having this conversation with me, and telling me about a family that he knew, where it was actually a woman who had lost both of her parents. And she pretty much shut down. Like she could not continue to function because she had lost her. I mean, this is a grown woman. And he said, I want to make sure that you are able to still be here for these children, to still parent these children. And so because of that conversation, I began to definitely continue the process of compartmentalizing my grief, where I would save my grief for Adrian. I would save my thoughts of Adrian for the last thing before I went to sleep at night, after the house was quiet, after sometimes I would walk the house while everyone else was asleep. And that was my time with Adrian. After everyone was going to sleep, but so that in the daytime, I didn't, still thinking about the concept of mirroring. I didn't want my children to grow up seeing their mother with a frown on her face all the time.
right.
I wanted them to know that joy can still happen in the midst of sorrow. And so I learned to compartmentalize that grief. That's another benefit of grief support groups, because it got to be where it was twice a month. I think then we took it down to once a month. I knew that that whatever date that grief support group was on, I knew that I would be able to go there and pour everything out. I could cry as much as I needed to. They would, in both of them, there was always something in your hand that you would hold. So a year after the Compassionate Friends, we found out about a local support group that specifically ministered to children. And so my children
so important.
go.
Yes.
And, my daughter was able to connect with another teenage girl who was also grieving. She had actually lost her father, but there was someone their age that they could mirror.
Right.
And so this particular support group had this very smooth little purple heart. It was named for their daughter. The founders had named it for their daughter, and everything about it was purple. And so we would pass around this purple heart. And while we had the heart in our hand, we could empty out everything, the things that we could not express on the job. And, sometimes there's such a thing as compassion fatigue.
Yes.
And sometimes friends may only walk with you for a little bit, and then they can't handle it anymore. And there were many relationships that ended for us. Because people who could not handle our level of grief. Some people told us, some people just ghosted us.
Wow.
And that's compounded grief.
Right, exactly. Because then you're losing your community on top of losing the person that you originally, were grieving over.
Absolutely.
And but it's such a deep grief. And if you've never been in that place and understand that, it's hard to be compassionate for the amount of time that really you need that compassion. You need that community in order to surround you. And so finding that support, you keep talking about this, and I hope that people that are listening are understanding that, back to what you talked about, this is not just for people that are weak.
Right.
It's
Right.
if you're going through a hard time, that hope is really hard to hold on to if you're all
Yes.
alone. You can
Yeah.
only do it for so long, and you've got to learn how to reach out and say, I need help. I need a community that's
Mhm.
willing to show me how to walk this path. You had said previously, understanding that people had been there for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, and they were still, processing, but they were learning how to live and to thrive with
Yes.
that loss, that hole. It's so important because it's a shift
Mhm.
in your entire lifestyle, and it wasn't where you planned to go, and you can either take that path that will lead you where your father-in-law, or was it your father-in-law,
Father-in-law. Mhm.
yes, had said, this is one way you could go. And
Right.
you could be like this one person that just, had all of this grief they bottled up, and it continually
Yeah.
showed on them, or you can release it in a
Mhm.
healthy way, the way God designed you to do this, and it's
Right.
by walking with others. We were made for community, and we have to grasp onto that. And I'm
Yeah.
so glad that your kids had found a community as well, because it's hard as a parent. Like you said, our relationships with that person will define our grief, and kids will process that much differently. But knowing other kids that
Mhm.
have been there and are going through that, has probably gave them the ability to release a lot of things that they didn't understand they were even processing, that probably
Right.
came out in behavior or shutdown,
Mhm.
or a whole mix of all of it.
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. Another wonderful uh, camp that my daughter went to, um, they still function. That camp still functions. And after she finished graduate school, she actually served on the board of directors and was a
Oh,
volunteer. And so being able to give back, being able to um, recognize, and especially like as you were saying, uh, some of the people who had been, it had been 5, 10 years or whatever, recognizing that fresh grief. Uh, when someone new comes in, sometimes it's a way to validate I was where they are,
right.
and I have come this far. Um, and so it's sometimes it's not just for them,
Right.
it's for you as well, just to see
Yes.
how far you've come.
Yeah, when we were talking before the show started too, you were talking about milestones
Ah,
and
yes,
some of those times that grief resurfaces. And if you've never lost somebody before, you don't understand how just something can trigger that grief so quickly.
mhm, mhm.
So you had said that there was just some milestones recently
Right,
that
right. College graduations,
mm,
high school graduations, things that we will never get to do for Adrian.
right,
Um, I don't have no weddings yet, no grandchildren yet, but all of those life events, new jobs, everything new comes with that underlying sadness of I wish I could share. Now we did,
right.
when Adrian was in the hospital, we did start a Caring Bridge page. Many people would be familiar with Caring Bridge, particularly
Yes.
if you have someone with a long-term illness and you're trying to keep everybody posted without having to tell the story over and over again.
Right.
Um,
Yes.
so for a time, I can look back in the guest book uh,
Oh,
that at
that's
certain
wonderful.
points, our children posted there as they grew. Dear Adrian, this happened.
Oh,
Dear Adrian, this happened. Um, and so, particularly, uh, college graduations, of course, are the most recent. And there's also, so our youngest was uh, exactly 10 years and 5 days younger than Adrian. So Adrian was turning 13 on the 25th. On the 20th, our youngest had turned 3. She doesn't really, so now she's 23.
Right.
She doesn't really have her own memories of Adrian. And that in and of itself is grief.
Yes. Never
Uh,
thought about that.
I also have a cousin whose father, my uncle, passed away. Uh, he's the same age as my second daughter. My uncle passed away before he was born. So Father's Day, seeing his posts around my uncle's birthday, and he looks exactly like him.
Wow.
Do you know how difficult it is? So now he's 31.
Hmm.
No, 32, turned 32. To have been told for 32 years that you look exactly like someone that you never had the opportunity to meet.
Yeah.
Similar circumstance with my youngest. My youngest daughter favors Adrian more than my second daughter. When she was a little girl, Adrian's friends would see her and, it was kind of scary.
Wow.
Those are uncomfortable moments. But what I've learned about my cousin's grief and about my youngest daughter's grief is grieving what you didn't have.
Yes.
We talked earlier about, I have a very close friend whose son was born with very debilitating health issues. And
Right.
so she had to grieve the loss of the child that she thought she was going to have.
Mm-hmm.
Miscarriages, same thing. Grieving the loss of what you thought you were going to have, in order to embrace what you were given and the blessing
Right.
of what you were given.
Hmm.
In a certain way, she's still kind of grieving because she feels that she has formed support with others, with children with similar disabilities, and she has seen some of them actually pass away, and so
Wow.
there's that fear.
Right. Yep.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
so and we talked about having been in a pandemic. Uh,
Yes.
and lots of loss. My son
Mm.
and I were both class of 2020, and neither of us got to have a commencement. And you might think, well, that's not a big deal. No, these milestones are very
The
important.
milestones.
And
Absolutely.
they mark our path. They are, if you have ever hiked in an unknown area, you need to mark your path, because if you're directionally challenged like me, you pass around the same block over.
Right.
One of my favorite scriptures is in I think it's Deuteronomy. You have walked around this mountain long enough. I can absolutely relate to that. I don't drive anywhere without my GPS, because I can't go not thinking. Another aspect of grieving. We talked about this in our grief support group. Driving while grieving.
Oh.
I think probably maybe even a lot of accidents may happen because you cannot. It is so difficult to keep your mind on the task at hand because it is still trying to process what has happened to you.
Wow.
Another aspect of extended grief is the why.
Mm.
And that why can happen even years later, because you know how we say that things are BC and AD, we put everything, that our frame of reference
Right.
is the resurrection. That's our frame of reference. Well, the death of a significant loved one is that
Yeah.
frame of reference, because the
Mhm.
person that I was before is not the person that I am now. And maybe even my family members are not the people that they were before. I was talking about my good friend Denise. We talk about that the
Mm.
person that there's also, we've had other losses, but there is a loss that significantly defines you. I have lost my mom. I lost my grandmother. I've lost all of my in-laws, except for my husband's stepmother, who is very dear to me. I've lost these people, but the one loss that is the most significant, that completely altered who Nichelle is as a person, is Adrian.
Yeah.
And so there are still years later, why did this happen? Because the entire world changed. We can see with the pandemic. With the pandemic, everything became virtual. I can remember as a little girl, I'm Gen X. I can remember as a very little girl, I still remember the milkman.
Oh yeah.
I remember
I do too.
grocery deliveries. And so look what the pandemic did. It rolled all of that back. It
Right.
brought things being delivered to that. So everything shifted, everything changed. I teach online rather than in person. Everything shifted. Some things are good because of the shift, and some things have gotten lost in translation. And that significant death, that trying to fit back into the mold of who I was before,
Yeah.
doesn't work. I had to learn who, and we go through this iteration many times. I've recently gone through empty nest.
Yep.
And someone coined the phrase, I cannot claim it myself, HENS, homeschool empty nest syndrome, because I feel homeschool empty nest is
I'm getting there. Yes.
different. Yeah.
It is because you've poured so much into your kids and your life has been about your kids.
Yeah.
And then it's another loss. Because those relationships are so close.
Yeah.
And it makes that parting even more difficult, and whether the parting was on good terms or bad terms. And I know in our family, it's not always been on good terms that our kids have left, and that's a whole nother grieving process.
Right.
But yeah, it is harder because you're not used to giving them up every day.
Right.
They're used to being in your home, and yes. And so, so your grief was compounded by having poured so much into your daughter. And like you said, your argument with God about, why did you allow me to do this and to pour this much into this child to only have this result? And yet God was so compassionate towards you and in showing you what you did for her eternal place and life.
But also think about when I think about what would have happened if we had not listened to the still small voice telling us that homeschooling was for us.
Yes.
We got to spend every single day with her.
Oh, absolutely.
Every single day. And so for that, sometimes when I would be in the support group, in the grief support groups, I would hear so much regret. I didn't really get to know them, or they had a whole life outside of me. I didn't have that testimony.
Right. Yeah.
I got to spend every single day with her. And for that, I am absolutely so grateful. So grateful.
That's amazing. Yeah.
And for my other children as well, even though they have had the nerve to grow up. The audacity, how dare they? But to have the privilege of having spent all of that time, that even though the transition was difficult, with our youngest, I was enmeshed in her activities. She was a Girl Scout, and she earned her bronze, silver, and gold awards in Girl Scouts. So I was accustomed to, taking her, driving her everywhere. And then all of a sudden, nowhere to go.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting you talking to other homeschool veterans, because, we never think we're going to reach this point. And then all of a sudden we do.
Right.
And we're like, okay, well, that's over and done.
So many of my friends, like they continue to have children. So it's
They're
going to be a
still in it.
long
Yes.
time,
Yeah.
before, but yeah.
Oh, absolutely. But it changes us.
Mm.
And I think that's the biggest thing that through our stories that we're sharing this month, that new homeschool moms don't realize. We see, like when we were first starting, we saw those people way ahead of us. And then we didn't have a whole lot of examples because homeschooling was illegal before we started.
Well, remember, I was
Or maybe
overseas,
when we were starting. Yes, exactly.
so yeah.
And but you saw those people and you're like, wow, that I could never be like that person. And now here you are. And the trials and the ups and downs, the experiences that God has given you has made your story and you into who God knew that he was molding and shaping yourself as well as your family. And those are the stories that are most impactful because we've leaned into him and we've trusted him, and his will, not the hopes and dreams we had to graduate our child at 13 and send them to college. Which would have been nice, but it's
I
not
remember
everybody's
a
story.
family with 10 children, and they were like the model, and like everybody had master's degrees at 15. And yeah, it's like, why can't you be like that?
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you so much, Nichelle, for sharing your story, and
Sure.
just being so real with us, about the process that you and your family went through as you just grieved your daughter's loss, but just continued through homeschooling, through life, and have triumphed over that. The ways that God has shown you how to, and being able to support others too. And I think that's, really what our stories are about. It's just, we give hope to others. Like you have talked many times throughout this hour, is just, we make it through a day, we make it through a week, we make it through a year. We learn how to process, and then we mirror, we work alongside one another, and we embrace grief the way we grieve, and we embrace other people's grief the way they grieve, and not be judgmental in that, but just loving and being willing to just take one day at a time for the gift that it is. And so thank you so much. I would love for you, as we close, to talk a little bit about your business too, and how you help homeschoolers, because Nichelle has a wonderful resource for you, and I want her to be able to share that as well.
Yes. So during the pandemic, when everything moved online, my daughters and I started a business where we are able to provide history education and government education to homeschool teens. So one of the things that I had to do as a bereaved mom trying to help a new teenager navigate through life it was to find out where her interests were, and
Absolutely.
and so I got dragged down the rabbit hole of history. Like history was her thing, and so we both have degrees in history now, and so we provide history education. Our youngest daughter, her political science is her thing, and so she teaches government classes. We're in the process of developing some asynchronous courses, but in the past we've taught just live, but college prep history classes taught by history professionals who are passionate about history.
Oh,
Like we
that's
just
amazing.
love history. So we are available. Sometimes this was something that I needed to learn. I had to outsource some things while grieving with a teenager, and so she was we had just in the Austin area started homeschool co-ops. And so having her find another trusted adult to be accountable to, we as homeschool moms, we assign a paper or whatever. And we say, okay, we want it done by noon on Friday, and noon on Friday comes and we've got like 3 sentences.
Right.
They're like, it's just mom. Well, one of the things that this particular daughter has taught me is that even when she got to college, she had some challenges with time management, because in the homeschool setting, we don't have these deadlines. And so it's important to find a trusted adult that your children can learn to be accountable to. And so, and also we really believe that history should be taught in community. It should be taught with exchanging ideas. Learning it out of a workbook is going to go in one ear and out the other.
Right. So. Yes. Yeah. History is about stories. It's the impact of lives lived and decisions made and all of those things. So much more impactful when you have that passionate person, and also just that ability to dialogue and process a lot of that. We just recently visited the Military Vehicles Museum out in Du Bois, Wyoming. It was fascinating. And we got the tour from the owner, and people said that just makes it even better. And it did. I mean, we spent just 2 hours and we barely made it through the museum, just him showing us these vehicles that he had collected. So, I totally get it. And so that's awesome. Well, I hope that our community will reach out to you. I know a lot of parents at this time are thinking about what are we going to do for next year. So if you're trying to think of what to do for history for some of those upper grade levels, reach out to Nichelle and her family and see what they have to offer. And so we'll make sure that link is also in the description. Thank you again, Nichelle. This was such a delightful an encouraging conversation, and thank you for being open and willing to share your story. It was very impactful, and you had so much good advice and wisdom to share.
My pleasure. Always available to talk to those who need to know someone else has experienced what we have gone through. Yeah. Well,
Appreciate that. It gives others hope, and we need a lot of that in this world.
Absolutely.
So yeah. Well, we're going to continue these conversations with homeschool veterans, and actually I'm doing all of them this week since I was on vacation for the last month. But Karina Moss is going to be with us on Thursday night, and she's going to talk to us about being a homeschool overcomer and her journey from fear to freedom, and how she moved past all the fears she had to homeschool with a newfound freedom that she wants to share with you. So that'll be Thursday night, and I hope you can join us then. Make sure also to check out Nichelle's website at warpandwefthistory.com. And then the one resource that she shared with us was compassionatefriends.org if you're looking for grief support as a family. And that you said that was a national organization.
Yes,
correct?
It is.
Yes. Awesome. Well, I just want to thank you all for joining us for this broadcast of Empowering Homeschool Conversations. God bless everyone. And thanks again, Nichelle. And we'll see you all next time.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
This is Empowering Homeschool Conversations, provided by SPED Homeschool. Go to spedhomeschool.com to get resources and support for teaching your unique learner at home.